Welcome back. Today we're going to take a look at 7hz Salnotes Zero. So Zero, of course, is their brand new one dynamic driver, released shortly after their planar called Dioko. So I actually do have both, but we're going to start with Zero. So before we begin, I really do want to thank 7hz and Salnotes and Linsoul for arranging this review sample, or review samples, as I have Dioko as well. So it's always great to work with a new company and a new store. So very much thank you to those guys for taking a chance and sending me a review sample. So for those of you who were following along like me for the release of Zero, I think that, it sounds kind of dumb, but the most important question was, what was the white plastic or, whatever color plastic you were going to purchase going to look like in person versus the photographs that were released online? And I think it doesn't photograph well because of how shiny it is and there's almost no texture to it. But in hand, it sort of feels a little more weighty and a little more solid than cheap plastic as you had in your mind when you were watching the images months ago like I was. So I think that was actually a little bit of a surprise how kind of nice it feels in the hand versus what it photographed and probably what it looks like on video right now. But in hand it's actually quite nice, and the lettering is actually quite nice. And the faceplate has this brushed metal look to it, so there's a little bit of nice contrast to it as well. Cable itself is, I think 7hz does a pretty good job on cables, and this one at the price point, you knew it wasn't going to be some monster 4-core braided set, but I think they did a really good job. Really nice accessories. The cable isn't super springy or tangly or any of those things, so they actually did a pretty good job there as well, and you get some nice angled to recessed 2-pin, which is actually always a good choice. So pretty good design choices right there. So tip-wise, you actually do end up with two sets of two different tips. One is more of an open set like this red one, and one is a more closed set like the yellow one. So you will want to take a look at both sets and try both sets because they will affect the sound. And this one will definitely be a set that you'll want to tip roll with the included tips and any tips that you might have in your desk as well. So let's begin with sort of the most important question that everyone has been asking was, is Zero or even Chew, are they both overhyped? And I will say no to both of them, because I think even with Chew, it wasn't so much that it was overhyped and it's a bad set that people just overhype to death. I think it's actually a very good set, but it very much has to be matched to the right person, the person who has a signature in a library and a listing style that is very much aligned to both Zero and Chew. And they both are very similar in signature. And if we look at it, a little closer, we can see that they're pretty much from all the way down to 20 up until about 5K. They are pretty much very, very similar or the same. So you have the same issue. It's a very kind of thin, lean signature, and that has to work with your library and your preferences. If you're kind of a more bassy type, lots of your listening library has lots of bass-driven tracks, this signature isn't going to work for you. You're going to purchase Zero or you're going to purchase Chew and then just say it was overhyped. So I think a lot of that talk about that set being overhyped wasn't so much that it's a bad set that people we're just saying it's a really good set for no reason. It's actually a very good set. Zero is a very good set. Both sets are actually very good, well-executed versions of that signature, but that signature doesn't work for everyone. So very much think about how that works or is going to work with your library and your listening style. And for I think both of them, it really comes down to how thin do you like your mid-bass. Some people really, really like a very clean, almost analytical, it's really that cleanliness of the signature because there's so little mid-bass, super clean, analytical, clear, transparent, all those things that you heard about Chew. I think Zero really inherits very much the same attributes, but that works for some genres, definitely not. Some listeners prefer more mid-bass, so that's sort of the dividing line for me. It's not a good or bad thing. It's not a hype overhype thing. It's strictly what does your library really align to bass-wise? What do you prefer? What's your listening style? Loud, soft, all those things sort of get wrapped up into a set that has, very well executed within certain parameters, and you have to really judge the set based on those, as opposed to the set, doesn't really work for R&B. Well, yeah, because the bass level is actually quite low, and it's supposed to be very clean, and you're trying to listen to a genre that really requires a higher level of bass and mid bass. So it's just not a good fit. So do very much consider that before you say it's good or bad or overhyped or underhyped. It's a lot of it is just matching this set to the proper person and listening style and library, like I said. So better than Chew? I don't know about that. I think they're very, very close, and I think ultimately the problem with Chew was it really depended on getting a good fit and a non-removable cable, which kind of annoyed people. And both of those things are essentially fixed on Zero. So I think just on those two criteria, you can say Zero is actually a better set. Even if you assume all the other technicals are pretty much the same on the two sets, I think I would go with the one that has the better fit in the cable, because I actually do like running Zero on a balanced dongle or a balanced DAC amp. I think a little more power is actually a great idea on Zero. It actually gives you a little more resolution, a little more detail, a little more openness. I think that is what this one really works well on. But, I think generally both sets actually are very, very nice sets, and both sets really did sort of move the bar for $20 budget sets. And like I said, I will take Zero simply because it's just slightly less fatiguing in that mid-treble area, because it has a little dip, and I think the stage works a little better for me on Zero as well. So I wouldn't say it's an overwhelming domination of Chew, but I will say that certain things about Zero I do very much prefer over Chew, or of Zero I prefer over Chew. And but generally I think they're actually quite close. Sound-wise, again, they're actually very close, and they both are sort of this neutral bright, leaning bright sound, very much a very strong upper mid. So you kind of get this very kind of not lean, but it is a lean bass signature going into the mids. There's almost no bleed. There's no, like zero bleed, and then you get this big open, clean, clear mids. And that rises kind of sharply, and I think both sets rise about to the same point. They both have this very strong lower treble, upper mid sound to them, and most of your tracks are going to sound, pretty much about right here. You're not really going to get too much of a contribution from the bass. So I would call that sort of this neutral bright, but really leaning bright. It really leans into these clean, clear, transparent mids, and there's a mid and treble focus to it. And that should really guide your source and tips as well. I definitely went to sort of the counter of those. Instead of going to a bright source, go to a warm source and go to the smaller bore tips. I think those work quite well to counterbalance what the signature actually is giving you. And a sort of brighter signature, so go to a warmer source, and I think there's a nice counterbalance there. So warmer source, smaller bore, and definitely do some tip rolling if it sounds a little too bright and a little too intense for you. So bass-wise, I think definitely the bass is the supporting player to the mids and the treble. It's just not a bass-dominant set. For those of you who prefer drums to be present but never distracting and fatiguing, even at higher volumes, that's exactly what Zero does. And, I think for the younger guys, I think you can deal with a whole lot of bass fatigue. I think older guys, cranky older guys like me, you listen to a set with too much bass for too long, and it ends up being quite fatiguing. And you'll notice it sort of right away with Zero, is it never really gets to that level at all. You might say it's a little bass shy, but you'll never say that you get bass fatigue. You can listen to it for a very, very long time and never really have that droning in your head that gets super fatiguing. So I think it does that very, very well. So it may not bring the boom and the slam to Metallica's Unforgiven. I think just level-wise and mid-bass-wise, it's just not going to get there. But when you want the drums to be an equal in a trio like Go-Go Penguin, lots of jazz, where you really need to hear the contribution equally from all the instruments, I think that's where this one really shines. It's got a soft slam, but really, like I said, it's got this long session, non-fatigue levels and bass. But you have to really match that to your library. If you're like a lot of bass, more bass, probably not going to work for you. And I would say it needs a little boost to carry through into the mids for more genres, just to give it a little more warmth, a little more depth. I think that would have opened it up to quite a few more genres. But as it is right now, it really kind of shines at jazz, things that aren't necessarily heavily bass driven, or especially those genres where you really don't want the bass to dominate the mids or the treble. That's exactly where Zero lives. So the mids, I will say it's very similar to Chew. It's got this big, open, dynamic, engaging, revealing midsection, which is both going to sound more than $20 and quickly reveal the small tuning tweaks that you might want to make with Sorcerer tips. It's super revealing and super open and transparent, and you'll hear right away either the upper mids are a little bit too sharp for you, a little bit too intense, so go to a smaller board tip, or you love that level of energy and excitement that you get at female vocals, and it's going to work perfectly for you. But you'll kind of get that hit in like the first couple minutes. There's nothing really hiding here. It's super revealing, super transparent. But I would say it's the reason to buy either set. I think both the mids and the treble on both sets are actually done very, very well. And for people looking for a mid-centric, mid-treble set, that's what Zero really delivers. So like Chew, I think your impression of the set is somewhat swayed by your tracks. So if you're listening to more bassier tracks, you're going to say it's a little bit too bass light. If you're at the other end, if you're at that gain area, maybe 2K to 5K, and you hit that really hard, you're going to say, well, it's a little bit too bright. If you're down in the lower mids, you might say it's a little bit more recessed. So this one, and I think Chew actually had the same exact problem. It is very much depending on where your library lands as you're listening to it. So I will say a track like I was listening to Martin Garrix's set from Tomorrowland last night. So his remix of Dua Lipa. So you listen to the music right up front, and you're like, it sounds a little bass light. It doesn't quite go as deep as it should. It doesn't really have the slam that it should, like we talked about. And then you hear Dua Lipa's voice, and you're like, oh, that's why I bought Zero, because her voice is exactly in the pocket for Zero, and it sounds really, really nice. And again, you have to get into this mindset of matching your library and your listening style to what Zero provides, and to hear her voice, and I'm sure lots and lots of female vocals love this kind of signature. Just big, open, energetic, detailed, sharp, everything that it should be is right there. So do think about that. So I will say at the low end, there might be a little bit kind of a recessed mid things happening. And in that case, I tended to bump the volume just a little bit. It adds a little more weight and a little depth to male vocals, but it's really right on the edge of being, kind of deep enough, bassy enough. I think more people would want a little more body to it. I think some of the male vocals that I listen to regularly, Sam Smith, Eddie Vedder, Joe Nichols, they would just do a little bit better with more body. But it's sort of being super, super picky about it. And you have to have tracks, again, in your library that sort of match those kind of vocals. But at the upper end, it's definitely more aggressive, where the lower end might be slightly recessed. There's none of that at the upper end. It's more aggressive, more forward, lean and edgy, and kind of borderline analytical. There's not a ton of warmth there, and I think that would be one bit that I would like to change. But as instruments and vocals lean into that bright and neutral bright area, everything is very much right there. There's nothing recessed, tons of energy. Everything that you're kind of expecting in the signature is right there. So, but it was probably the part that I would change. I think it's just a little bit too forward. I think it does flatten the stage a little bit. Just, reduce it just a hair, I think actually works out quite well. And definitely do play with tips, because that's exactly what that will do. But for me, like that opening to Rosanna and Toto, it's just the whole thing kind of flattened, and it was noticeable. It wasn't like, it sounds like Toto, but the stage actually changed quite a bit, and it was kind of immediately noticeable to me. So for me, I would sacrifice some detail and some of that forwardness for a more consistent stage, and probably a little bit more warmth to cut through to some of that rise in the pinna gain area. I think would actually work out pretty well. So we'll talk about that a little bit later as well. So 0 versus Chew, kind of in the mids. I actually like Chew out of the box with spring tips. I thought it was a very good representation of Moondrop tuning. It's kind of a reference Moondrop sound to it. So I didn't really have any of that complaints to it. With 0, I think it's a lot more flexible, especially when you change the tips. It was definitely more fun to tweak, and you should really make this one yours. For Chew, I pretty much kept it stock, and I sort of liked having that Moondrop style. For 0, I think you should definitely play more with it, change tips, change sources, definitely make this one yours. It takes EQ kind of well as well, so I think lots and lots of tweaking can go on with 0, whereas I for some reason I just kept Moondrop's Chew the way it was, so I will sort of go with the flexibility of 0 on that as well. Treble wise, kind of similar, but what it really comes down to on this, and everything is pretty much right there. And I said this exactly with Chew too. This straight across plateau that doesn't dip at all on Chew is going to appeal to some people. Some people like me will really prefer that dip that 0 did. So I will take the dip, every day, all day. Even if everything else is exactly the same, I will still go with the dip. And this peak should actually be about there. So ignore that little difference. They're supposed to be in the same spot. But this is sort of the more important part of, as you hear the electric guitar, snare drums, things that kind of stand out on Chew as slightly elevated, just dipping that down is a little bit less fatiguing. They don't pop out as much for me, and that is always my preference. So that is pretty much what's going on in the treble bit right here. So the lower starts out bright and it slopes down as it should. That's what I prefer. The second part I would change is that lower treble is just a bit too dominant for me and a bit aggressive, and it masks the upper treble a little bit, so you don't get as much air as you think you're going to get looking at the graph. And I think a lot of that is just pushing down the lower treble just a little bit so you can hear more and it's better balanced, and I think that would actually work out better. But again, that's a super big nitpick. What's more important is that 3 to 8K dip for me. That's really more important. Less fatiguing, more forgiving, easier to smooth over with tips. Again, this flexibility and how it changes with tips is actually quite important. But both of them do have this similar smooth, non-peaky treble after the gain area, which is similar to both. And again, in the $20 area, it's actually not all that common to have such a smooth, non-peaky treble. So something that's worth talking about. Stage, and I'll say the stage on 0, not huge, but I would also say it's more consistent than Chew. I actually liked it more than Chew, generally. It sounds more immersive out of the box, and I think the tracks that don't hit the gain area pretty hard tend to be, those softer tracks tend to be more immersive, more depth, and it's a very nice experience on 0. Both sets are clean and clear and play right into great imaging, layering, and separation at that price. So not all that far, but I definitely prefer the stage on 0, but pretty close. So the last bit, we'll talk about this. So for the hobbyists, the guys who like to really play around with it, I will say that if you want something a little more bassier, you can actually put clear tape or micropore tape on this vent right here. That will get you a couple dB of bass, and that looks, let's see, that looks like this. So this red line is actually clear tape. So the bass will actually come up about 2 dB through the sub bass. Not a whole lot of change, but that took you about 2 seconds to put some tape over the vent. So what you can do if the upper mid intensity is kind of a little bit much for you, this is what I did. So take a very small piece of micropore tape and partially cover the nozzle. And what that does for you on the graph is it really softens the whole lower treble bit. So instead of peaking at about 3K, which might sound a little bit more forward to you, that's the blue line, which is the stock version. So that peaked a little early, about 3K. If you put some kind of dampener, whether that's micropore tape or a Tanya damper or anything that alters that on the nozzle, it tends to push the peak out just a little bit. And for me, this was a really great change. So it softens up that intensity at the upper mids, and it pushed the peak out so it sounds a little bit less forward, and it really increased the dip just a hair, because I like the dip anyway, and a little bit more dip was actually fine here. So you may think that if you really like Salnotes Zero stock and you love those female vocal energy and everything, that very energetic upper mid, this may sound too dampened, but for me, this became a lot less fatiguing, more forgiving, just kind of a longer set that worked better with my library. And you increase the bass a little bit here and sort of address the two things that I really talked about in the review. So things to try. Like I said, there's lots and lots of small tweaks that you can do with Zero, and its flexibility and how it was sort of out of the box is really on the borderline of, not enough bass, too much upper mids, and you can really push it in either direction quite easily with some tips or source. So I very much appreciate, you can, if you just review it out of the box, it's one way, but sets that can be easily swayed to really make them yours, to dial them into sounds that you prefer, are so always a bonus in my book. So again, that is what I have on Salnotes Zero, and we'll get to Dioko soon. But thank you guys for tuning in, and we'll see you next time.